Okay, so I want us to talk about installing databases. And for you to level up on SQL, we're going to have you install MySQL, which is a very popular database that is free, that a lot of communities use. And I want you to be able to install MySQL. Now, there are various ways that you can install MySQL. You can use Homebrew or different service, different package manager to install different software. You can also download a zip file, and then there may be an installer that you can reuse that gives you a step-by-step instruction. Or you can also do things in the terminal. Again, there are many different ways. But before we talk about some of the step-by-step instruction and how to install it, which you can find from multiple resources, let's stay a little bit high level. Okay. And let's think about this a little bit. So I pulled out my paper. I hope you can see this better. So when you're creating a web application, um, or okay, well, how do we explain this? When you're creating a web application, you have to create a web server. And a web server is nothing more than a computer that other people can talk to, right? And we talked about IP address and so forth. Well, let me introduce this concept about a port number. So imagine that this is your computer. I'm gonna just kind of explain it like this, okay? And imagine there are a bunch of information here, in this territory. But the way to retrieve this information, just kind of imagine that this is in the ocean, in the middle of the ocean. It's isolated, it's self-contained, right? Because information in your computer is kind of independent, it's self-contained. But imagine that there are these little docks where if someone wants to get information from your computer, they can send a boat, and a little boat. Okay, that's a boat. Sorry for the bad drawing. They can land on this port, and they can dock there, and then get information. Right? Okay, so that's basically your computer, and let's say the port. There are different numbers for different port. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there are lots of them. Maybe you can even have port 9999. Okay, so I won't go into the details about some of these architecture, but the way that this works is a port number is usually there, and different programs like to reside at certain port. So for example, if it is MySQL likes to use port 3306 or another port number by default. Port number 80 is usually reserved for websites. So if you go to a website, cnn.com, they're going to assume that you want to go to port 80 because the internet standard is if you don't specify the port number, if you just specify the domain name, then it will go to port 80 on that computer. But you can have it say, okay, I want it to go to cnn.com, but instead of port 80, I want to have it go to port 8080. Then you can have also port 8080, and if there's another web server listening, maybe they go different routes and get different information than a computer program that's sitting on port 80 that goes this way. Okay, does that make sense? So this is what the port numbers are, and you can use this as an interesting way to also hack into a system, because usually by looking at a port number, you can find out which programming is being run. And if you find out, oh, on port 3306, it's using MySQL version 5.3. Version 5.3 is known to have some security issues, X, Y, and Z. Hackers can hack into your system by taking advantage of maybe some of the program not being updated that's sitting on that port. They may also scan and say, oh, you got some of these ports open, and I can inject some things and get some of this information and leave without you ever knowing about it. So anyway, some of the hacking is also can be related as you look into the port number There are programs that scans different ports, and you can do all that. But that's kind of the beyond the scope of this. Just know that for MySQL, I can also have the program and have it sit or have it occupy a specific port number. So when you install MySQL, you got to remember, hey, which port did I tell MySQL program to sit and listen for another ship to come or another HTTP request coming or some request coming and sending a request to that port. So you got to remember that. What you may also find that, hey, look, maybe you installed MySQL one way and it got installed on port 3306, but then the next time you tried to install MySQL, it saw that port 3306 was occupied, and then maybe you installed it on port 8080. And again, depends, right? Depending on if you're using Mac or Windows, or if you're installing using Homebrew or, some installer package. By default, it may have installed it on different ports. So to pay attention to which port you're installing MySQL, also for each port, you have to set up a username, root username, and a password. Write it down or remember it, because if you forget that, there may be ways to uninstall the program there, but hey, just try not to forget. Okay? But anyway, sometimes students have installed 3 different MySQL that are running on different ports, and maybe they're connecting to this one when they wanted to connect to this one, and vice versa. So anyway, you gotta have that in mind. So when you're starting a SQL for the very first time, what I would recommend is just make sure you try to install just one. If you already installed one, you don't need to reinstall another one on another port. You can just use the one that you've already installed and just use that. Okay? So anyway, this I hope gave you some understanding on how port works. Later, when you learn about cloud and setting, up the server and protecting, the ports and, setting up the firewall and other things, you can do a little bit more. But in a nutshell, right, that's not that hard to explain. This is my computer. I have different computer programs or software listening for someone else to come in and send requests. So then, the programs will go and get some information from my computer and it will send out. Yes, I can have some port number that's not being occupied. That's completely okay. Yes, I may have some old programs sitting on certain port number that, hey, if the hackers found out that I was using an old version that didn't have some of the security things patched up, hey, they can come and attack and they will come and leave without you ever knowing. So anyway, those are some of the things to have in mind. Okay, now let's shift gear a little bit and let's talk about this tool that I want to introduce. So this is called MySQL Workbench. Now, there are what's called the graphical user interface. So it's also called the GUI, G-U-I. Now, there are multiple graphical user interface or applications that you can use to do SQL queries, where you can open up a terminal or command prompt, go directly and just type in MySQL queries directly in the terminal. So that may make it look cool, but I personally really like this tool, MySQL Workbench. I've been using it for years now. And when you install this, again, it may look a little bit different than my version. It's okay. You got to figure out how to use different, GUI. But, just at a high level, what it allows you to do is it allows you to connect to different MySQL connections. Some of it can be my local computer, so localhost port 3306. I can also access maybe another database, remote database. So you can also use the interface to connect to another database. So that's really cool. But one of the feature here I really like is using this workbench, I can create what's called an entity relationship diagram. And it's just a really, it's a good visualization tool where I can visualize different database tables. And later when you get into the exercise of creating databases, that tool can become very, very handy. So I love it. But just know that this is just one graphical user interface. Someone built it on top of the MySQL database engine. And, there's nothing magical really. Okay. But anyway, it's just very convenient. I can connect to my local database I can browse and see what are all the different database schemas that I have. We're going to use the Sakilla one for some of your homework assignment for you to get better. We're also going to use the world database. So I can also look at, okay, what are the tables that I have? If I want to look at, some of the records, I can right click, select rows, and notice that it automatically generates that SQL statement and it tells me the results here. I can modify, I can run all the queries just by clicking on that lightning bolt and then reruns that query. Also below, let me see if I move this a little bit. It also tells me some of the results. How many rows were returned. Look at this, how long it took for the query to perform and so forth. I can do other neat things using this. I can modify records here and I can click on apply, and when I do that it generates additional things on additional queries. So instead of writing all of this SQL query, just makes it very easy for you to select some records, for you to also manage the table and so forth. So anyway, I'll introduce a little bit later on some of the other videos how to do some of these things using this interface. Just know for now that there are many graphical user interface out there, but for the purpose of this, let's just use MySQL Workbench. And later when you use Postgres or other databases, there are other graphical user interface that you can use. And it will look pretty similar where you can look at all the different schemas, tables, create tables. But this tool again has some additional fancy features that I haven't seen in other GUI, including creating entity relationship diagram. I can also monitor remote SQL servers and get some beautiful graphs that tells me some very interesting stats about how well SQL database is running, and that's also part of this. So anyway, just really nice tool that you can install and tinker with. Okay.